French onion soup. It looks like it belongs in a white tablecloth restaurant. It didn't start there. Onions were among the cheapest and most abundant vegetables in medieval France, the kind of ingredient poor communities could always access, regardless of season or circumstance. The soup built around them was peasant food. Simple, affordable, made from almost nothing. Parisian restaurants discovered it in the 18th century and began serving it to a different kind of customer entirely. The gratinade cheese crust arrived later still. Most of the people who originally made this soup never ate it that way. Les Halles, the great central market of Paris, became most associated with its urban identity, market workers eating it before dawn as a restorative after long cold nights. The ingredients never changed. The audience did. The peasants who invented it never tasted the version the world now considers classic. Clam chowder. 2 versions. 1 argument. No resolution. New England. Makes it with cream, a thick ivory soup built on clams, potatoes, and dairy that the region has been defending as the only legitimate version since the 1800s. Manhattan makes it with tomato, a thinner, redder soup that New England considers a fundamental corruption of everything chowder is supposed to be. The disagreement escalated far beyond dinner tables. In 1939, a Maine state legislator introduced a bill making it illegal to add tomatoes to clam chowder. The bill was not a joke. It passed. No enforcement mechanism existed, and no one was ever prosecuted, but the legislature had made its position clear. The argument has continued in exactly the same terms for 80 years since. New England has not softened its position. Manhattan has not removed the tomatoes. The chowder war has no end date. Ramen. It is not Japanese. Not originally. The noodle soups that became ramen arrived from China, and Japanese cooks transformed them so completely that China barely recognizes the connection anymore. The 4 major regional styles, Sapporo, Tokyo, Hakata, Kyoto, each built distinct broths and toppings that specialists treat as fundamentally different products, sharing only a name. Then, 1958 arrived. Japan was still recovering from World War II, and Momofuku Ando spent a year in a shed experimenting with flash-frying noodles to preserve them. The result was instant ramen. Ando thought he was addressing a temporary hunger crisis. Over 100 billion servings are consumed every year. The problem he was trying to solve no longer exists. The solution never went away. Pho! Nobody agrees on where it came from. Most food historians place it in northern Vietnam in the early 20th century, where a street food culture was absorbing influences from multiple directions simultaneously. One of those directions was France. Vietnam was under French colonial occupation, and the long simmered bone broth at the heart of pho bears a striking resemblance to pot-au-feu, a French beef stew that colonial soldiers were eating in the same cities at the same time. Whether the technique was borrowed or arrived independently has never been resolved. The country divided. The North kept pho simple and austere. The South made it sweeter. After 1975, Vietnamese refugees carried it to America, and from there, it traveled everywhere. The dish that couldn't agree on its own origin became one of the most recognized soups on earth. Tomato soup. The tomato was considered poisonous in America well into the 1800s. Not dangerous, poisonous. The leaves and stems contain toxic alkaloids. And for centuries, that was enough for most people to assume the fruit was equally harmful. Cookbooks warned against it. The tomato sat in American gardens as an ornamental plant for decades, grown for appearance rather than consumption. By the late 1800s, tomatoes were accepted widely enough that Joseph Campbell could build a business around them. His company launched condensed tomato soup in 1897, and the red and white can became a fixture in American kitchens within a generation. Then, 1962 arrived. Andy Warhol selected that exact can as the subject of his most famous work and elevated an industrial food product into one of the most recognizable images in art history. Campbell's made soup. Warhol made it immortal. Gumbo. The word comes from gumbo, the Bantu word for okra, carried to Louisiana by enslaved West Africans who used the vegetable as both ingredient and thickener. The roux that forms the base comes from French colonial cooking. The filet powder used as an additional thickener comes from the Choctaw Nation, whose knowledge of local sassafras plants shaped Louisiana cooking in ways rarely acknowledged. Spanish, Caribbean, and Creole influences arrived on top and stayed. No chef designed this. Louisiana was the place where West African, French, Native American, and Creole culinary traditions existed in close enough proximity that they ended up in the same bowl. Every other American dish traces back to one tradition that traveled. Gumbo required all of them at once, and a specific place on Earth where that was possible. Attempts to recreate it anywhere else consistently fall short in ways that Louisiana cooks can identify immediately. Wantton soup. The name came first. Wantton in Cantonese, swallowing clouds, a description of the way folded dumplings billow and float in hot broth that someone decided was too accurate not to keep. The soup originated in Guangdong province, where the Cantonese tradition of wantton noodle soup became one of the defining dishes of the region. The Shanghainese developed their own version, wontons in broth without noodles, and Cantonese cooks considered it a different dish entirely despite sharing the same name. Cantonese immigrants carried the soup to America through early Chinese restaurants in the 19th century, making it one of the first Chinese dishes most Americans ever encountered. It arrived in a white paper container and became so familiar it stopped feeling foreign. Swallowing clouds ended up in a takeout bag. Nobody questioned it. Chicken noodle soup. The tradition is older than America by several thousand years. Jewish communities in Eastern Europe were making golden broth as a medicinal food long before the first chicken noodle soup can existed. Eastern European immigrants carried the tradition to America in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and it embedded itself into the broader culture before anyone thought to put it in a can. Campbell's standardized it in the 1930s, and the canned version became so dominant it replaced the memory of where the soup came from. Then, in 2000, a study published in the journal Chest found that chicken soup inhibits neutrophil migration in ways that genuinely reduce upper respiratory inflammation. Scientists spent decades trying to explain something Jewish grandmothers already knew. The soup ended up as the universal symbol of care across a culture that largely forgot it arrived from somewhere else.